Millionaire CEO goes to a winter party alone and meets his ex-wife with quadruplets identical to him. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Snow fell like slow confetti outside the arched windows of the Windsor Grand Hotel, each flake catching in the golden glow of Manhattan's winter lights. Inside the grand ballroom, violins danced lightly through the air, mingling with the laughter of men in tailored tuxedos and women wrapped in satin and diamonds. It was the kind of evening where deals were toasted with champagne and alliances whispered behind closed doors. At the far end of the ballroom, standing slightly apart from the crowd, was Graham Whitaker. He wore success like a second skin. Perfectly fitted tuxedo, cufflinks discreetly gleaming, and a wristwatch that likely cost more than the chandelier above him. To most, he was the embodiment of achievement, the self-made tech billionaire, founder and CEO of Whitaker Innovations, a man whose name graced headlines and Forbes covers alike. But to Graham, he was a shadow among lights. He raised his glass mechanically as another well-wisher clapped him on the shoulder. "Brilliant quarter, Graham. You've outdone yourself again." He nodded, murmured a polite response, and let the conversation drift elsewhere. His mind wasn't in the room. It hadn't been in any room, really, for quite some time. 6 years. That was how long it had been since Elise walked out of his life. Since the final conversation that shattered the illusion of control he'd wrapped around his world like armor. "You want an empire," she had whispered that day, eyes rimmed with exhaustion and pain. "I want a life." The echo of those words had stayed with him, though he buried them beneath board meetings, innovation patents, and billion-dollar acquisitions. Tonight, they stirred again, faintly, like a breath against a mirror, as he watched couples move gracefully across the polished marble floor, laughter lighting their faces. He had arrived alone, despite the empty invitations extended to companions who came and went, none of whom ever truly stayed. He was here because appearances demanded it, because the Winter Gala had become as much tradition as obligation. Still, he'd expected the hollowness. What he hadn't expected was what happened next. He was reaching for another flute of champagne when someone, caught his eye through the frosted glass pane of the ballroom doors. He froze. Just outside, beyond the glitz and velvet ropes, stood a woman in a simple gray coat, her auburn hair tucked beneath a knit hat, and beside her, 4 small children. 4 boys. Something in him jolted. He took a step closer to the glass, squinting past the soft blur of snow and city light. The woman turned, just slightly, to adjust the scarf on one of the children. Her profile hit him like a blow. Elise. His breath caught, and the boys, no older than 5, turned with her. They looked up, alert to the rustle of the wind, the movement of the city. Graham's heart plummeted, because they didn't just resemble children. They resembled him. All 4. Same sharp jawline. Same sea glass eyes. Same thick, dark hair. One of them laughed, the sound faint through the glass, but clear in its familiarity. It tugged at something deep, ancient, aching. The glass in Graham's hand slipped. It hit the marble floor with a crystalline crash, drawing startled glances from nearby guests. He didn't register the sound, or the champagne puddling at his feet. He was already moving, past the coat check, past the security nods and polite murmurs, out through the tall revolving doors into the sting of winter air. The city greeted him with its familiar, numbing chill. The sidewalk was wet, reflecting 1,000 fractured lights. He scanned the street. They were only feet away, huddled near a closed coffee shop, the kids blowing into their hands to stay warm. He approached slowly, almost reverently, as if afraid the scene would vanish. Elise. She turned at the sound of her name. Her expression shifted from alertness to disbelief to guarded calm. Graham. Silence yawned between them, the kind that holds years of words left unsaid. "They're mine, aren't they?" he asked softly. Elise looked down at the 4 boys now gathered at her feet, each gripping a small hand warmer. One of them, the tallest, stepped slightly in front of the others, protective. Graham felt his chest tighten. "Let's talk somewhere warm," Elise said finally. Her voice was even, but her eyes shimmered. He nodded, and in that moment, everything he thought he knew about his life, the neatly drawn lines of ambition, legacy, solitude, began to unravel in the falling snow. Shadows in plain sight. The chandelier above shimmered like a frozen cascade, scattering light across polished marble and the champagne flutes that caught laughter as easily as the bubbles. Within, Graham Whitaker stood near the edge of the ballroom, a quiet figure in a room of well-practiced smiles and curated charisma. His conversation with the CFO of a rival firm faded as his eyes caught something that made time stop. Elise. Not just Elise. She stood near the grand entrance, her auburn hair tied back in a loose knot, her coat threadbare at the sleeves, clutching a small satchel tightly. She didn't belong to the decadence of the ballroom, and she wasn't alone, for boys stood at her side, surrounding her like orbiting moons. They couldn't have been older than 5 or 6, but Graham's breath caught because each of them had his eyes, that impossible shade of blue, his angular cheekbones, his silence. He didn't remember walking, only the blur of silk gowns and tuxedos as he made his way to her. Elise. She froze. It was the kind of stillness that spoke of survival instinct, not fear. Slowly, her eyes rose to meet his. Brown, warm, tired. Behind her, the boys fidgeted restlessly. "Graham," she said, with a softness that held steel beneath. He didn't know what to say. All words felt useless. He glanced at the children. One was holding a paper cup of lukewarm cocoa. Another clutched a plastic dinosaur, its tail missing. They were dressed neatly, but the coats were too thin for winter. Their shoes had seen better years. His voice emerged hoarse. "Are they?" She nodded before he could finish. "Yes." The word shattered something inside him. He staggered a half-step back. "Why didn't you?" He began, but Elise's eyes narrowed. "Not here," she said firmly, with a glance at the crowd, at the children. "Not in front of them." Graham nodded, stunned. "There's a cafe across the street. Quiet. Warm. Come with me. All of you. Please." Elise hesitated. Her eyes moved from him to the children, to the doors behind her, as if weighing every possible escape. Then she turned to the boys. "Come on, sweethearts. We're going with an old friend." Old friend. The phrase felt like a thorn in Graham's ribs. The cafe was nearly empty. A jazz melody played faintly in the background. The boys slid into a booth by the window while Elise helped them with their coats. Graham ordered hot chocolates and muffins, his hands trembling. He watched them. He still couldn't believe it. For little boys. For pieces of him that he never knew existed. One had a tiny scar on his chin. Another had a stubborn cowlick. The smallest one's eyes sparkled with mischief. "What are their names?" he finally asked, sitting across from her. Elise sighed, her fingers wrapped around her mug. From left to right, she nodded toward them. "Theo, Jude, Milo, and Quinn." He repeated the names under his breath. "They're mine." "Yes," she said again. "Ours." The boys were talking among themselves, sharing bites, kicking their legs rhythmically under the table. One reached over and wiped cocoa from his brother's nose without being asked. "Why didn't you tell me?" Graham's voice was quiet. Elise met his gaze. "I tried. I called. I left messages. Your assistant said you were unavailable." His stomach turned. He knew exactly which assistant that had been. Ruthlessly efficient. She protected his time like a guard dog. "It was right after the divorce," Elise continued. "You were launching the new division. I was alone. I thought maybe it was better that way." Graham ran his fingers through his hair. "God, Elise. I didn't know." "I know." A silence settled between them. Not angry, just heavy. "Do they know?" he asked. Elise shook her head. "No, not yet. I didn't want to confuse them. They know they don't have a dad. They've asked. I just didn't have the answer yet. Let me be the one to give it to them." She looked startled. "Graham, it's not that simple." "No," he said with a shaky breath. "It never is. But I want to try." Theo approached their table, just then, climbing onto the bench beside Elise. He whispered something into her ear. She smiled. "He wants to know if it's okay to get another muffin." Graham stood. "Come on, buddy. Let's go get it together." Theo looked up at him with a mixture of awe and caution. But he slid out of the booth and placed his small hand into Graham's. That simple touch undid him. As they walked to the counter, Graham blinked back the sting in his eyes. He had missed 5 whole years. First steps. First words. The first time they drew a crooked heart on a birthday card. He had chased boardrooms and stock prices while his own blood was learning to hold a crayon. Not anymore. Not another day. As Theo pointed to his favorite muffin, Graham turned and saw Elise watching them. Her expression unreadable. Maybe it wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But maybe it was the beginning of something better. Something still possible. Something called a second chance. The awakening. The diner Elise had chosen was modest, nestled on a quiet side street in lower Manhattan, far removed from the world of champagne flutes and billion-dollar deals Graham had just stepped out of. The contrast struck him as more than just visual. It was visceral. It was the first real space he had occupied in a long time where silence wasn't about control or power. Here it was just space. Space for breath. Space for truth. Elise sat across from him in the corner booth, her hands wrapped tightly around a chipped ceramic mug filled with lukewarm coffee. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes, those same gray-blue eyes he used to dream about when ambition hadn't yet consumed him, were weary. And surrounding her, like planets orbiting a quiet sun, were 4 small boys, identical down to the tilt of their heads and the arch of their brows. Graham had studied their faces in stolen glances since they sat down, each one a mirror, uncannily so, reflecting parts of himself he didn't know were missing. Theo, the one seated closest to Elise, was quiet, his posture protective. Jude played with the napkin dispenser, occasionally sneaking glances at Graham, brows furrowed in thought. Milo seemed entranced by the sound of the overhead fan, and Quinn stared straight at him, unblinking. Elise finally broke the silence. "They're 5. It was a small sentence, but to Graham, it struck like a gavel. His chest tightened. 5, he repeated softly, as if tasting the number. His throat constricted around the syllable. 5 years of birthdays. 5 Christmases. 5 summers. 5 lives lived without him. They were born 7 months after I left," she continued. "I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized." He nodded slowly, as though each word were another wave crashing into a shore he no longer recognized. "You didn't think I deserved to know?" Elise flinched. "I tried, Graham. I called your office. I left messages. But your assistant, Grace, said you were too busy, that you were traveling. And then she stopped taking my calls altogether." Grace! The name fell from his mouth like ash. She had been his gatekeeper, loyal, tireless, and ruthless. Elise looked away. "I stopped trying after the 3rd time. I had no more energy to waste chasing a man who had chosen everything else over me. He wanted to protest, to defend himself. But the truth settled like dust between them. Elise had every reason to believe he wouldn't care. Back then, he wouldn't have. Not in the way he should have. "And so you raised them alone?" She nodded. "With help at first. My sister. A couple friends. But it was always just us." The boys were now quietly coloring on the backs of placemats. A box of dull crayons passed between them. Graham stared at them, his throat burning. "What are their names?" "Theo is the oldest by 2 minutes," Elise began, her voice gentler now. "He's my rock, always looking out for the others. Jude is the curious one, always asking questions. Milo is my dreamer. He talks in his sleep, tells stories to clouds. And Quinn sees everything. He doesn't say much, but when he does, it matters." Graham absorbed every word like scripture. Names he hadn't known he would ache for. Personalities that were foreign but already so precious. "They look like me." Elise smiled faintly. "They are you, and me, and everything in between." Graham exhaled slowly. The reality of fatherhood, of lost time, landed in him like a stone at the bottom of a well. "What now?" he asked, voice barely audible. "Now," Elise echoed. She looked down at her coffee. "Now we figure out what's possible. What's safe?" He nodded. "I want to know them. All of them. Not just their faces. I want to know who they are. Who they've been. That's going to take more than good intentions, Graham." "I know," he said. But good intentions are the only currency I have that isn't wrapped in power or pride. Elise looked at him for a long time. There was no forgiveness yet in her gaze, but there was something else, maybe the slightest tilt toward hope. Start small, she said at last. Be there. Show up. Every day. Without expectation. Without conditions. Okay, he whispered. It wasn't a promise sealed in ink or boardroom agreement. It was heavier, realer. Quinn wandered over to their side of the booth, his tiny sneakers thudding softly on the linoleum. He looked up at Graham with an expression that was both childlike and ancient. Are you sad? He asked. Graham bent forward, his heart tight. Yeah, buddy, I think I am. Quinn didn't say anything in return. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sticker, a smiley face. He pressed it to Graham's lapel like a badge. And Graham Whitaker, once named one of the most powerful men in American business, felt his soul fracture and begin, quietly, to mend. That night, long after Elise had taken the boys home, Graham stood alone on the sidewalk, staring at the empty diner. The wind bit at his coat, but he didn't feel the cold. All he could think of was four names: Theo, Jude, Milo, Quinn, and the way the youngest of them had wordlessly offered him the first seed of grace. He hadn't earned them. Not yet. But for the first time in years, Graham didn't feel powerful. He felt human. And that was the beginning. The distance between regret and forgiveness. The hotel lounge was quieter now. The clink of glasses and low hum of chamber music faded into the background as Graham followed Elise through an arched hallway toward a private sitting room lined with floor-to-ceiling windows. The glow of Manhattan stretched behind the glass, 1,000 lives flickering in miniature. But Graham barely noticed. All he could see was her, Elise, and the storm behind her tired, cautious eyes. She stopped in the center of the room, folding her arms tightly across her chest. Graham stayed near the doorway for a moment, the weight of everything he didn't know about her life anchoring his feet. Why didn't you tell me? His voice cracked more than he expected. He tried again, softer. Elise. For boys. Our sons. She turned to face him fully, her face calm but pale. Do you think I didn't try? He blinked, thrown. I never got a call. Never a letter. Nothing. Her jaw clenched. That's because your assistant blocked me. I called 3 times the week I found out I was pregnant. I sent a letter to your office. A letter, Graham. His chest tightened. No one told me. Elise, if I had known, would it have made a difference? She asked, her tone sharper now. You were halfway across the world, sealing deals and being profiled in Forbes. I was at a free clinic, terrified out of my mind, holding 4 tiny heartbeats inside me and no one to call. Graham took a step closer. I would have come back. She shook her head. Don't say that. Because I needed you to come back long before there were children. I needed you when I stopped recognizing myself in our marriage. When every conversation became about numbers and growth projections. I was trying to build something for us, he said, almost defensively. You were trying to outrun your father's ghost, she replied, and for a moment, the words hung like glass between them, fragile and damning. He sank into a nearby chair, his breath uneven. You're right. That seemed to startle her. You're right, he repeated. I thought if I could just prove I was better than him, more successful, I'd somehow erase everything he did to us. I didn't realize I was becoming him in the process. For a moment, Elise said nothing. Then she crossed the room slowly, sitting in the chair opposite his. Graham, this isn't about blame anymore. I made my choices too, but I want you to understand something. She opened her purse and pulled out a worn photo. It showed 4 baby boys swaddled in blue, each marked with a colored band on their wrist. Caleb, Jude, Milo, and Quinn, she said quietly. I named them alone. I raised them alone. I sat in the ER when Milo had his first asthma attack. I held Quinn through nights of fever and tremors. I watched Jude get shoved in preschool because he was too quiet, and Caleb still looks for you every time we pass someone in suit. Her voice broke then, the composure splintering. And I told them you were busy, that you loved them, that one day you'd come. Graham couldn't breathe. The image of 4 versions of himself, small, hurting, waiting, seared into him. I'm here now, he whispered. Elise met his gaze. Then prove it. Not to me. To them. He nodded, slowly, painfully. Outside the window, the lights of the city blinked on, one by one. Inside the quiet room, something deeper than apology stirred between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of something harder. Truth, spoken aloud at last. Graham had never felt more uncertain of his place in the world. The Winter Gala, once a routine event of power and prestige, had turned into a reckoning. For the first time in years, he felt raw, stripped of titles, accolades, and control. He had just learned that the 4 boys clinging to Elise were his sons. And just as his world began to tilt towards something deeper, something truer, it collided hard with the life he had built to protect himself. Vanessa Greer arrived like a storm cloaked in silk. Her red dress caught the light like fire, heels clicking across marble floors with precision. She moved through the crowd effortlessly, every glance acknowledging her beauty, her confidence, her status. She was a staple in Graham's public life, the perfect companion for interviews, galas, and board dinners. But tonight, that perfection turned to poison. "There you are," she said smoothly, sliding her hand onto Graham's forearm. Her eyes sparkled until she followed his gaze. Elise stood quietly by the far end of the room, her posture guarded, the boys now sitting quietly in a row of chairs, fidgeting with napkins and staring wide-eyed at the splendor around them. Vanessa's smile faltered. "Who are they?" she asked. Graham hesitated. Vanessa followed his silence, the sharp intuition of a woman who had long learned to read the room. Her voice dropped. "Is this why you've been distracted?" He nodded slightly, bracing himself. She blinked, then turned fully to him. "They're yours, aren't they?" Graham's throat tightened. Yes. It was a single syllable, but it shifted the entire evening. Vanessa's eyes widened, then narrowed. "And that woman, Elise, your ex-wife? She's back. With 4 children? And you what? You believe this?" Just like that. It's not just belief. It's truth. Vanessa took a step back, her voice rising. "After all these years, she shows up with 4 identical kids, and you don't see what this is?" "Graham, it's a trap." The room around them began to blur. People glanced over. The murmur started. "You think she's using them?" Graham asked, his tone more defensive than intended. "What else would she be doing?" "You got money, Graham. Influence. A company that's about to go public in a deal worth billions. And now, suddenly, for heirs? Come on." He swallowed hard. The line between past and present, between loyalty and reality, was thinning. "You don't know her." Vanessa folded her arms. "I know enough. I've seen this play before. Women clinging to old ties when it suits them. She's been gone for years, Graham. She left you." "I left her," he said quietly. Vanessa paused. "I left her to chase all this." He gestured around them, to the gold, the grandeur, the hollowness. "And in doing so, I missed everything that mattered." Her voice softened, but it came with steel. "You're throwing your life away for a fantasy." Graham met her eyes. "No, Vanessa. I'm finally waking up." She stared at him, recognition dawning. Not just that something had changed, but that something deep inside him had broken free. Then she turned. "I hope she's worth it." Graham didn't stop her as she walked away. He looked back at the boys, Theo chewing on the corner of his coat, Milo balancing a dessert fork on his nose. Jude tried to keep Quinn from knocking over a glass. Elise caught his gaze. Her eyes said everything. She had not asked for this confrontation, nor had she expected protection. She had raised them without him. He took a deep breath and walked back toward them. He sat beside Elise. "I'm sorry," he said. "About the scene." She shook her head. "I've lived through worse." There was silence between them. Then Graham leaned closer. "I don't want to miss anything else." The words weren't just for Elise. They were for Theo, Jude, Milo, and Quinn, and for the version of himself he had abandoned long ago. That night, Graham didn't go back to the penthouse. He walked through the streets of Manhattan, past the glowing storefronts, past his old life. And with every step, he moved closer to something real. The storm didn't break with thunder. It began with a whisper. Graham was seated in his corner office at Whitaker Innovations, the morning light just beginning to paint the skyline of Manhattan in gold, when Serena, his longtime assistant, stepped in with a pale face and a tablet shaking in her hands. "You need to see this," she said, her voice a whisper too. Graham took the tablet. A headline stared back at him from one of the city's most aggressive business tabloids. Graham Whitaker's hidden family. CEO caught in love child scandal with ex-wife. The article was brutal. It detailed his past marriage to Elise, speculated about their separation, and all but accused her of raising his children in secret to leverage his empire. Photos of Elise and the boys outside a modest grocery store, grainy shots of Graham in the park with them, even a distorted image of his face peering out of a diner window with 4 identical children across the table. It was all there. Graham stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. He felt a coldness creep in his chest, not from shame, but from rage. Not at Elise, not at the children, at himself for not seeing this coming. Within an hour, the story had made the rounds. News networks picked it up. Social media buzzed with speculation and judgment. Investors sent nervous emails. Wallace stormed into his office. "We need to respond," Wallace said sharply, throwing down a stack of printed coverage. "This is spiraling out of control. Victor Langford has already scheduled a press conference for noon. You think that's a coincidence? He's going to pounce." Graham rubbed his temples, his mind spinning. "They're my sons," he said simply. "Whatever the media spins, it doesn't change that. You think the board cares about that right now?" Wallace hissed. "Graham, we're in the middle of finalizing the Singapore deal. Our valuation is at an all-time high. If we look unstable, then let it drop," Graham interrupted, standing. "I'll talk to the board myself." And Victor. The press conference was held in the company auditorium. It was supposed to be about Whitaker Innovations' upcoming AI release. But every question was personal. Graham stood at the podium, his tailored suit immaculate, his eyes steady. "Yes, I have 4 sons," he said, calm yet unyielding. "Yes, I was unaware of their existence until recently. And yes, I am committed to being in their lives. My personal life is not a liability. It's a reckoning, a chance to be the man I should have been." Murmurs filled the room. A few camera shutters clicked. But there was something else too. Respect, maybe. That evening, Elise called. Her voice was tight. "The kids saw the news," she said. "How glad?" Jude asked if he was a mistake. Graham felt his heart split down the middle. "I'm coming over." At her apartment, the boys were huddled on the couch, the TV muted but still displaying his image. He knelt before them. "You are not mistakes," he said, his voice thick. "You are the best thing that's ever happened to me. I'm sorry the world is loud right now, but I promise you, I'm not going anywhere." Theo looked at him with tearful eyes. "Even if people are mean?" Graham nodded. "Especially then." Later, after the boys fell asleep, Elise sat beside him. "You didn't owe them that press conference," she said quietly. "No," Graham replied, "but I owed it to my sons, to myself. I'm done hiding." Outside, the storm continued to rage, in the headlines, in boardrooms, in whispered corners of the business world. But inside that small apartment there was peace, and a man slowly becoming whole. And for the first time in years, Graham Whitaker wasn't afraid of the noise, because he had found something louder, stronger: family. The snowfall had lightened by morning, leaving a thin white sheet over the sidewalks of Manhattan. Graham Whitaker stood by the large window of his penthouse, staring out at the city that had once mirrored everything he thought he wanted: status, control, isolation. But today, something felt irrevocably altered. He hadn't slept, not since the night before, when he'd seen Elise cradling Quinn in her arms as cameras flashed around them outside the hotel. The frightened cries of his sons, the way Jude had clung to Elise's coat, and the exhaustion etched on her face had burned into him like scars he couldn't unsee. He had always prided himself on his control. Deals made on red-eye flights, empires built between midnight emails. But no amount of control had stopped him from missing 5 birthdays, from not knowing that Milo liked astronomy, or that Theo had asthma, or that Jude slept with a book under his pillow because it helped him feel less alone. And now the tabloids screamed headlines: Whitaker's secret heirs, empire deceit, Elise Marlowe, mother of the missing Whitaker line. Victor Langford, his longtime business rival, had pounced, calling shareholders into emergency meetings and questioning Graham's capacity to lead. The press were camped outside Whitaker Innovations, their lenses pointed like rifles. His phone buzzed with Wallace's latest message. Damage control is slipping. You need to distance yourself. But Graham didn't reply. Not this time. Instead, he was staring at a photo on the kitchen counter. It was hastily drawn, crayon on printer paper. 5 stick figures holding hands. For small, one tall, all of them smiling. Us, Milo had said when he handed it to Graham with shy pride. In case you forget. And Graham had whispered, more to himself than the boy, I won't. By noon, Graham was at Elise's apartment. She opened the door cautiously, weariness in her eyes. Graham, the boys are resting. We haven't had a moment of peace since yesterday. He held up his hand, voice low. I know. I'm not here to talk. I'm here to protect you. She blinked, startled. I hired private security. There's a team stationed at the corner now. Discreet. They'll keep the press from your door. Elise stepped back slightly, arms folded. You think that makes it better? No, he admitted. It doesn't. But it's a start. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. Come. Inside, toys were scattered, books half-read on the floor. The signs of life, of childhood. For a moment, Graham just stood there, breathing in the quiet chaos that had never existed in his sterile high-rise world. The boys are scared, Elise said, sitting on the armrest of the couch. Every knock on the door, they flinch. I want to make that stop, he said. Not just the press. All of it. The instability. The hiding. They deserve more. And what do you deserve, Graham? She asked gently. After all these years? He looked at her, eyes rimmed with fatigue and something deeper. Clarity. A chance to do it right. 2 days later, Graham stood before the board of Whitaker Innovations. Effective immediately, he said, his voice calm but firm. I am stepping down as CEO. Murmurs erupted. Wallace stared at him in disbelief. I will remain as executive chair, Graham continued, to support a seamless transition. But I will no longer allow this company to define my worth. Victor Langford's shadow had hovered for weeks, whispering into corners about Graham's instability. But Graham had found something stronger than reputation, conviction. Outside, under the brutal scrutiny of the press, he spoke clearly and without a script. Yes, I have children. 4 incredible boys. And I miss their first steps, their first words. But I will not miss another moment. And for once, the city listened. Not to a CEO, but to a father reclaiming his humanity. Back at Elise's, Graham found himself kneeling on the rug, helping Quinn build a cardboard castle. Theo was drawing galaxies. Jude was curled against Elise, book in hand, and Milo sat beside Graham, watching him tape a turret with serious concentration. Will it fall? Milo asked. Graham paused. Only if we stop holding it together. The boy nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Elise met his eyes, and for the first time in years, she didn't look like she was preparing to run. They didn't need apologies that night. Only presence. Only love, finally spoken without words. The late afternoon sun stretched golden fingers through the windows of the modest 2-bedroom apartment, where laughter and the scent of grilled cheese. Sandwiches filled the air. Graham Whitaker, once the solitary ruler of Whitaker Innovations, now stood barefoot in a kitchen too small for his frame, wearing an apron with little dinosaurs printed on it. Theo, the most outspoken of the 4 boys, leaned over the counter, licking a smudge of peanut butter off his hand. Dad, he said, savoring the word, as though testing it for the first time, can we make the volcano explode again after dinner? Graham smiled and ruffled the boy's hair. Of course, but this time, goggles on for everyone. We're not repeating the great baking soda incident. From the living room, Milo shouted, It wasn't my fault. Quinn poured too much vinegar. Quinn, the quietest of the group, merely looked up from the picture he was coloring, lips pressed into a knowing smile. Graham chuckled. These small moments had become the bedrock of his new life. Just 2 months earlier, his world had consisted of glass towers and market trends. Now it was drawings on the fridge, bedtime stories, and questions like, why is the sky blue? And can dogs talk to each other? And, truth be told, Graham had never felt more needed, more grounded. His mornings began with packing lunches while humming along to cartoons, tying 4 pairs of sneakers, and reminding at least 2 children that capes were not appropriate school attire. He relished every second. And then there was career day. Elise had been hesitant. "Only if you're sure," she said, worry behind her eyes. "They talk about you at school. Some of the parents know who you are. I don't want the boys to be treated differently." "They already are," Graham said gently. "They have you. Now they have me too. That makes them extraordinary." On the day of the event, Graham arrived at the school with a presentation printed on colorful poster boards. Instead of charts and financial projections, he talked about ideas, about how imagination leads to invention. He let each boy help demonstrate a part of the talk. Quinn handed out stickers. Milo explained a simple coding game. Theo asked the class if anyone wanted to build a robot army. Jude, ever the organizer, passed around the markers. When he was done, the applause wasn't just polite. It was heartfelt. More importantly, the look of pride on his sons' faces stayed with him far longer than any standing ovation from shareholder meeting. That night, they had cereal for dinner at the boys' request and piled onto the couch to watch old space documentaries. Jude fell asleep on Graham's shoulder. Milo curled into Elise. For a few precious hours, time stood still. And yet, outside these walls, the world remained complex. Wallace continued to press. "You're missing the quarterly. Do you understand the signal that sends? Investors are nervous." Graham stared at his brother across their sleek office desk. "Let them be. I'm not leaving, Wallace. But I'm not sacrificing them either." Wallace leaned back, folding his arms. "You're building a life that doesn't include the company." Graham shook his head. "I'm building a life that includes what matters." That night, as Elise stood beside him washing dishes, she said softly, "You're doing it, you know." "Doing what?" "Becoming their father. Not just in name, in presence, in effort." Graham looked at her. Her eyes were tired but kind. The same eyes he had once ignored in the pursuit of legacy. Now, he saw them for what they were. The compass of a life he had almost lost. The boys burst into the kitchen, clamoring about bath time negotiations. Graham scooped Quinn into his arms. "One more chapter of the Dragon Book before bed. That's the deal." Theo pulled at his sleeve. "Can we make pancakes in the morning?" He glanced at Elise. She nodded with a smile. "Pancakes it is," he said. The next morning, as sunlight filtered into the apartment, Graham flipped pancakes shaped like rockets and bears. Jude spilled syrup. Milo asked if he could help next time. Quinn brought his drawing of their family to the table. Graham looked around the table, heart full. This was success. This was the legacy he wanted to leave behind. And it had nothing to do with stocks or headlines. It had everything to do with the sound of 4 small voices laughing in unison, and the quiet peace that came from finally being where he belonged. The turning point. Rain glazed the windows of Graham Whitaker's penthouse as he stood by the glass, watching the lights of Manhattan flicker like 1,000 beating hearts. The world below never slowed down. The meetings, the investments, the power plays, they were still humming, persistent and indifferent. But something within Graham had shifted irreversibly. The boys were asleep in the guest bedrooms down the hall, their backpacks still lying beside the couch where they had abandoned them earlier. Elise had just left after helping him prepare dinner and reading a chapter of Where the Wild Things Are. The scent of grilled cheese and warm tomato soup still lingered, faintly in the air. It was a simple evening, but to Graham, it felt like something sacred. He reached for his phone, scrolled through his calendar, and stared at the wall of back-to-back board meetings, product reviews, and cross-continental Zoom calls. There was a time he would have been invigorated by it. Now it felt like static drowning out the melody of something far more vital. The next morning, Graham arrived at Whitaker Innovations 2 hours earlier than usual. He stood in the executive conference room overlooking the city as Wallace strode in, coffee in one hand and a tablet in the other. "You look like you didn't sleep," Wallace said. "I didn't." Wallace raised a brow. "The boys." Graham smiled faintly. "One of them had a bad dream. Quinn. I stayed up telling him about how I used to imagine stars being lanterns for lost ships. He liked that." Wallace smirked, but said nothing. Graham cleared his throat. I asked for this meeting because there's something I need to do. Something overdue. Wallace sat down, eyes narrowing with suspicion. I'm listening. Graham took a breath, then said clearly, I'm stepping down as CEO. The silence that followed could have cracked glass. You what? I'm stepping down. Not leaving, but transitioning to chairman of the board. I need to be home more. With the boys. With Elise. Wallace leaned back slowly, processing. You're going to abandon the company you built to play house. I'm not abandoning anything, Graham replied, his tone firm but calm. I'm choosing a different kind of leadership, one where my presence matters more than my signatures. Wallace crossed his arms. And what will investors say? You think they'll welcome a leadership vacuum with open arms? There won't be a vacuum. I've been grooming Sarah Chun and Devin Marks for 2 years. They're ready. They'll handle operations. Wallace shook his head. And the press? You think they won't spin this into a crisis? Graham looked his brother square in the eye. Let them. A week later, Graham stood before a packed auditorium in Whitaker Innovations headquarters. Press, shareholders, board members, they were all there. Microphones, cameras, and flashing lights. For the first time, Graham wasn't hiding behind curated statements or media advisors. He adjusted the mic and began. Good morning. I stand here not to talk about market shares or tech forecasts, but something far more personal. Over the last months, my life has changed in a way I never expected. I became a father to 4 incredible boys. Their names are Theo, Jude, Milo, and Quinn. A ripple spread through the crowd. Some gasps, some smiles. This isn't a scandal. It's not a failure of judgment. It's a rediscovery of what truly matters. I spent years building an empire, but I missed birthdays, first steps, scraped knees, and nighttime fears. No title is worth that loss. He paused. That is why, effective today, I'm stepping down as CEO. I will remain as chairman of the board to advise and support. But my priority is my family. And as part of this new chapter, I am proud to announce the launch of the Whitaker Family Foundation. A logo appeared on the screen behind him. A stylized tree made of circuit branches and roots of interlocked hands. Our mission is simple: to support single parents, fund educational initiatives for underserved children, and create mentorship programs where innovation meets compassion. The room, once tense, erupted into applause. That evening, Graham sat on the floor of Elise's apartment, surrounded by crayons, Legos, and 4 messy-haired boys eager to show him their day's drawings. Theo handed him a picture of a tall figure holding hands with 4 smaller ones. That's you, Dad. And us. Graham swallowed a lump in his throat. I love it. Are you going to be home tomorrow, too? Milo asked. Graham looked at them, then at Elise, standing quietly by the kitchen, her expression unreadable but soft. I will. I'm not going anywhere. And he meant it. For the first time in decades, Graham Whitaker was no longer chasing legacy in skyscrapers and shareholder reports. He was living it, on floors covered in crayon wrappers, in bedtime stories whispered into quiet rooms, in the look of trust returning to the eyes of the woman he once lost. His empire would continue, but his home was finally built on something unshakable: love, presence, redemption, and 4 little boys who unknowingly saved their father from himself. Reconciliation and rebuilding trust. Graham Whitaker sat quietly in a small corner cafe, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows casting warm patterns on the old oak table. In front of him, a cup of black coffee steamed gently, but his mind was elsewhere, far from the comforting aroma or gentle background music. His thoughts were full of memories, decisions, and the weight of what came next. Since stepping down from his CEO role at Whitaker Innovations to prioritize his family, Graham had come to understand that rebuilding a relationship with Elise was more than just co-parenting. It was about reclaiming trust, healing old wounds, and rediscovering the love they once shared, not through grand gestures, but through patience and honesty. The first conversations. Initially, most of Graham and Elise's interactions revolved around the children: Theo, Jude, Milo, and Quinn. They coordinated school pickups, attended parent-teacher conferences, and cheered together at soccer games and science fairs. While cordial and cooperative, there was always a quiet tension, a space between them that neither dared to cross. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, they found themselves alone in the living room. The only sound was the gentle ticking of the clock and the occasional rustle from the boys' room down the hall. Graham cleared his throat, his voice low but certain. "Elise, I think it's time we talk. Really talk. Not just about logistics or bedtime routines, but about us. About everything." Elise met his eyes with caution, her expression unreadable. "I don't even know where to start, Graham. There's so much we left unsaid." "I know," he said softly. "But I believe if we don't try, if we keep pretending those wounds aren't there, we'll never heal. And neither will our kids." Facing the past. Over the following weeks, they began having quiet, open conversations, sometimes in parks, sometimes over coffee, sometimes in whispered exchanges on the porch steps while the boys played inside. Graham confessed his regrets, how he let ambition blind him, how he ignored Elise's silent pleas for presence and partnership. He apologized, not just for walking away, but for not listening, not noticing, not staying. Elise, in turn, spoke of the long nights, the loneliness, the exhaustion. She shared how she once believed love could carry them through anything, but eventually felt like she was carrying everything alone. "I used to wait for your calls," she admitted one night, "even after we divorced. I kept hoping maybe you'd remember what we once were." Those words broke something in Graham. Or maybe they fixed something he hadn't realized was broken. Rebuilding brick by brick. They began rebuilding from scratch, not rushing, not pushing, just being there. Together. They attended co-parenting workshops, learned better ways to communicate, and carved out time just for themselves. Walks through Central Park. An occasional old movie on a Saturday night. Long talks under the glow of string lights in Elise's modest backyard. Slowly, they got to know each other again, not as the people they used to be, but as who they'd become. Graham started noticing things he hadn't before. How Elise always kept her keys in the front right pocket. How she hummed old Ella Fitzgerald tunes while folding laundry. How her smile had softened over the years but still held the same fire. And Elise saw the changes too. How Graham listened now. How he showed up early for school concerts. How he never left without hugging each child goodbye. Moments that mattered. One autumn afternoon, the kids were playing tag at the park while Graham and Elise sat watching on a bench nearby. He reached for her hand, tentative, unsure. She didn't pull away. "Elise," he said quietly, "I know we may never be what we once were, but maybe we could be something better, something stronger." She looked at him, her eyes soft. "We already are, toward the future." Their love didn't roar back like a wildfire. It returned like a sunrise, gentle, steady, undeniable. The kids began to notice too. "Mom laughs more when Dad's around," Milo once said to Quinn, who nodded solemnly and added, "And Dad sings in the kitchen now." One night, as they tucked the boys in, Theo whispered, "I like it when we're all together. It feels right." That was all the confirmation either of them needed. They weren't perfect. They still disagreed sometimes about bedtime snacks, school schedules, or whether the boys needed another Lego set. But now, those disagreements came with mutual respect and the shared understanding that they were a team. Rebuilding trust isn't a single decision. It's thousands of little ones. It's showing up even when it's hard. It's saying, "I'm sorry," and meaning it. It's learning to listen even when it's uncomfortable. For Graham and Elise, the journey was far from over. But for the first time in years, it felt like they were walking it side by side. And in every laugh from their children, every quiet moment shared between them, every meal eaten together at the same table, they were reminded of this simple, powerful truth. Sometimes, love returns not with a promise, but with presence. And presence, in the end, is everything. A commitment to family's future. Graham Whitaker sat in quiet contemplation by the window of his luxury apartment, gazing down at the ceaseless rush of Manhattan streets. The city lights glimmered on the glass, casting fractured reflections across his thoughtful face. It had been months since he stepped down as CEO of Whitaker Innovations to be more present for his family. And yet, even with all the effort he'd made to rebuild what was lost with Elise and the boys, something still felt missing, a place they could truly call home. Searching for a true home, Graham knew they needed more than just time together. They needed a foundation, a beginning. Not a penthouse high above the world, but a place grounded in warmth and love. A house where memories could be built. He spent weeks with Elise touring neighborhoods outside the city, searching for a modest yet welcoming home. One with a backyard big enough for 4 boys to run freely, where seasons would be marked by leaf piles and snowmen, not board meetings and market trends. Together, they made small decisions. The color of the front door, whether to plant lilacs or sunflowers by the walkway. In each conversation, Graham could feel a quiet closeness returning, not only between him and Elise, but in the way the boys began to dream aloud, about bunk beds, tree houses, and dinners that lasted long after dessert. Rewriting his calendar, rebuilding his life. The transformation didn't stop at property lines. Graham took deliberate steps to restructure his daily routine. No more late-night strategy calls or missed breakfasts. Instead, mornings began with waffles and shared laughter. Graham would tie shoelaces and zip jackets before the boys marched out the door with their lunchboxes. School runs became a ritual, a space for jokes, riddles, and morning pep talks. After-school hours were reserved for science fairs, soccer games, and spontaneous dance parties in the living room. At night, he read stories under a blanket fort made of couch cushions and whispered, "I'm proud of you," into sleepy ears. No moment left behind. Graham's greatest lesson didn't come from boardrooms or balance sheets, but from the quiet rhythm of fatherhood. A crayon drawing handed to him by Quinn with the words, "Our family," scribbled underneath. A silent glance from Jude that meant, "Thank you for showing up." He realized success wasn't measured in quarterly gains or media recognition. It was in knowing that his kids didn't have to wonder where he was. He was there. He was present. He was theirs. An ordinary night, an extraordinary life. One evening, as they gathered on the couch watching an old animated movie, Graham looked around. Elise's head resting on a pillow beside him. Theo dozing on his lap. Milo giggling at a silly character. Jude leaning his head on Elise. Quinn curled up at his feet. There was no fanfare, no grand declarations. Just warmth, belonging, and the quiet heartbeat of a family healing. He smiled to himself and whispered, "This is it. This is everything." The morning of the twins' 6th birthday dawned with the quiet promise of something new. The backyard of their new home, a modest craftsman-style house nestled in a quiet neighborhood of Westchester, was adorned with colorful streamers, picnic blankets, and handmade paper lanterns. It wasn't a grand estate. It didn't have ocean views or a rooftop helipad, but it had something Graham Whitaker had never known he wanted until recently. The sound of children laughing, the scent of pancakes Elise made in the kitchen, and the tiny fingerprints on the glass door that led to the yard. He stood by the grill, a checked apron tied loosely around his waist, flipping veggie burgers with a surprising grace for someone who had once held nothing heavier than a pen. A slight breeze stirred his hair as he glanced over to where Theo, Jude, Milo, and Quinn were running barefoot through the grass, chasing bubbles like time didn't exist. Elise appeared beside him, handing him a pitcher of lemonade. Her presence was calm now, no longer tense like those early days. She wore a simple linen dress, her hair pulled back, and her eyes, the same ones he remembered from years before, reflected something that resembled peace. "They're happy," Graham said quietly. "Because you're here," she replied. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched Quinn gently pull Jude back from the sprinkler, worried he might slip. That protective instinct made Graham's chest tighten with emotion. The children had grown so fast in the few short months he'd known them, but in their eyes, he saw eternity. "I used to think success meant never slowing down," Graham admitted. "Always pushing, always proving something. But this," he nodded toward the yard, toward the life they'd created from pieces once broken. "This feels more real than any award I've ever accepted." They sat down on the porch steps, shoulder to shoulder, as the children sang a made-up song about birthday cake and jelly beans. Graham felt Elise's hand brush lightly against his. She didn't pull away. After cake and chaos, As the sun dipped lower behind the fence, the boys sprawled out on a quilt with their new toys. Graham found himself lying beside them, Jude curled into his side, Theo asking 100 questions about stars and galaxies. Elise knelt to tuck a blanket around them all, and Graham caught her eye. This is everything. She smiled, not in the way someone does when they agree, but in the way someone does when they know you finally understand. Later, as twilight deepened and fireflies blinked like little promises across the lawn, Graham sat on the back step, watching his family. Elise joined him with 2 mugs of chamomile tea. "Do you regret anything?" she asked. He exhaled slowly. "Every moment I missed," he said, "but not today. Today I feel whole." Elise placed a gentle hand on his knee. "Then maybe that's what matters. Not how we began, but how we choose to continue." Graham looked out at the 4 little souls who carried pieces of him in their laughter, their questions, their stubborn streaks. They didn't care about net worths or headlines. They cared that he was there, that he showed up. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" "For raising them, for not giving up, and for letting me earn a place here." She squeezed his hand. "You didn't have to earn it. You just had to want it enough." The stars emerged overhead one by one, and in the quiet hum of nightfall, Graham Whitaker, once the man who conquered markets and masterminded mergers, sat surrounded by the only legacy that truly mattered: love, forgiveness, and 4 small boys who now called him Dad. He wasn't perfect. He never would be. But as he kissed each sleeping forehead that night, whispering promises he intended to keep, Graham knew one thing with unshakable certainty. This was the life he was always meant to build. Not with headlines, not with titles, but with heart. Beneath the polished image of Graham Whitaker, the Millionaire CEO, once hailed as a titan of the tech world, is a story that many of us can see parts of ourselves in. He spent his life chasing power, status, and numbers that spoke of success, only to discover, in the eyes of 4 little boys he never knew he had, that none of it mattered without presence. Graham's journey isn't just one of redemption. It's a mirror that reflects the cost of losing sight of what truly matters, and the hope of reclaiming it if we dare to stop and turn around. In today's society, where individual accomplishments are often celebrated more than quiet acts of love, Graham's story is a gentle but powerful wake-up call. We let our careers define our worth, forgetting that real success isn't measured in dollars or titles, but in moments of presence. Children don't need a father who's a legend in Forbes. They need one who kneels to tie their shoelaces, who listens, who reads them stories before bed. What Graham did took courage. He admitted his mistakes. But even more bravely, he chose a new path, one that led away from corporate thrones and into a world he'd never known before. The world of bedtime giggles, morning school runs, and little arms wrapping around him in trust. In choosing his children, he didn't just reclaim them. He found himself again. The man who once prided himself on being right learned how to be real. And that's the lesson for all of us. It's never too late to love the right way. It's never too late to call your parents, sit on the floor with your kids, or take the hand of someone you once lost and say, "Let's try again." Life doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be honest. And love, when placed where it belongs, will always be the strongest foundation we have. Graham Whitaker isn't just a character in a story. He's every one of us who's ever lost their way and found the strength to come back. In a world that moves faster every day, maybe what matters most isn't the speed, but the direction. And maybe, just maybe, turning toward family, toward home, is always the right one. Before we go, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Are you tuning in from the heartland of America, a quiet countryside, or maybe a bustling city dreaming of open fields? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. And if this story touched your heart, inspired you, or simply gave you a moment of warmth in your day, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another uplifting story like this. Thank you so much for being here. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to bring you more heartfelt stories soon. Until next time, stay kind, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next one.